Becomes very, very clear is that we live in a world where there really isn't an established, stable balance of power. They're not just simply punishing Maduro, they're also claiming to act as overlords to Venezuela. They've unleashed a chain of events whose consequences is very difficult to predict. And what Trump is very good at is posturing not subject to any restraint. It's a way of intimidating opponents. It's a way of putting others on the defensive. When he says, the only thing that restrains him is his own morality, what he's really saying is that he's going to do what he can get away with.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Frank Furedi. Frank, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Really good to have you on. I'm trying to make sense of global affairs and the seeming spurt of instability that we're all living through. And I thought, what better person to speak to than Frank Furedi? You've been writing about global issues for a very long time. You've written some great stuff over the past week on your Substack and for Spiked. And I just want to try and figure out what's going on. So to the everyday onlooker, it looks like things have got quite unstable quite quickly. So there's been the Venezuela regime decapitation. There's the uprising in Iran and the question of whether that will involve intervention by external powers. Of course, there's Ukraine and Gaza. It seems like a pretty warlike atmosphere we find ourselves in. How would you categorize this era in terms of those international conflicts and international affairs?
Well, I think you have to remember that many of these conflicts have been around for some time, but they've been contained because nobody really wanted to bring them to a head. And now what's happened is that it's no longer possible to avoid these conflicts acquiring momentum. And what becomes very, very clear is that we live in a world where there really isn't an established, stable balance of power. It's not as if people know their place in the world. And therefore, everybody's positioning themselves. And the problem is that they're positioning themselves, but they're led by people who are very unclear about where they should be situated. I think one of the big tragedies today is that the key players, the individuals who run the big nations and institutions, are themselves geopolitically illiterate, and they are making things up as they're going along. And it's particularly clear in the case of the United States, but it's the same problem in Europe and elsewhere. We have to remember that this is a Western problem, principally. It's the West that subjected itself to these conflicts. Elsewhere, there is a lot of reluctance to get involved, and elsewhere they're basically looking at what kind of a mess the West is making for itself before they jump in and take a position.
That's a useful kickoff. And I did want to ask you in a minute about what other powers are making of all of this and how they might position themselves. But just to focus on a couple of those conflicts first and what they might tell us about the era we're living in, I want to kick off by asking you about Venezuela, because that took a lot of people by surprise. A very swift operation, in and out, taking the president, taking him back to America to put him on trial. Not regime change in the way that we've known it over the past 20 years, but nonetheless a very striking operation. That's given rise to lots and lots of discussion about the new era of might is right, and we now have a president who thinks he can do whatever he wants. How do you understand the Venezuela operation? You've been a critic of externally imposed regime change for quite some time. Do you see that this as being in the same vein as that, or is it something a bit different?
Well, the way it's presented is that it's not really a form of classical intervention, that America is reacting to the threat that Venezuela posed in terms of drugs and large numbers of illegal migrants coming into the country. And to some extent, it's very difficult to feel very sorry for Maduro and his regime, given their horrible record over the years. But I think what happened here is that Washington must have decided that they have to make some kind of a statement in the domain of foreign policy. Venezuela was like an obvious target given their pre-existing problems and tensions, and they managed to pull off what is technically a very impressive operation. So the way they managed to get Maduro, get him back to the States, a textbook example of an operation. But the problem is that they're not just simply uh, punishing Maduro, they're also claiming to act as overlords to Venezuela. And they're doing that in a context where they've unleashed a chain of events whose consequences is very difficult to predict. We don't know what's going to happen in Venezuela, but we know from the examples of Libya, Syria, and other places that very often when you intervene, you end up in a situation which is very messy and where you create a dynamic of conflict. And I would imagine that Venezuela is not going to be uh, turning into a peaceful democratic state anytime soon, and that there's a lot of problems ahead, which people haven't really worked out. So it's really a short-termist reaction, where I'm not sure that there's a long-term plan about the future of that part of the world.
And when you read about the Don-roe doctrine and, the kind of the Trumpified version of the Monroe Doctrine and this notion that this is an attempt to reassert hemispheric influence and, to reclaim that part of the world for the United States, and everyone else can butt out China, Iran, whoever else was associating with Russia, whoever else was associating with Venezuela, your time is up. For some time, people have talked about Latin America as being the United States' backyard. And of course, there have been interventions there over the decades, including the removal of people from power in Panama and elsewhere. How do you see Trump's intervention against Maduro fitting into that history? Is it a reassertion of that, or is there something different going on here?
I think it's a little bit different. I think that, first of all, many of these interventions tend to be performative, in that if you look at America's interventions if you begin with Grenada last century, and if you look at the intervention in Panama and now in Venezuela, they are often against very soft targets where it's very difficult to have a major military setback. So, in a sense, these are very easy wins. These are low hanging fruits that they're going for. That's very important to bear in mind. But in reality, what Washington is doing, the White House is doing, is they're playing catch up to China, particularly China, because China has been very, very active in Latin America. It's established very strong links in many, many parts of that continent. And I think that at the moment, what Washington is really worried about is being outflanked even in its own continent. In many ways, this is very different than the Monroe Doctrine, because the Monroe Doctrine was created to keep Europe out of Latin America. That was the main purpose, so that America had this hegemonic position there. Whereas in Latin America today is already subject to multiple influences, of which the United States is only one. So it's a much more complex situation. And I think a lot of the foreign policy interventions that Washington is going to engage in is to play catch up with China without directly confronting China. That seems to be a very constant theme in what's happening. Washington has, you know, criticized China, but at the same time developed trade relations with China. It hasn't really, with any serious effort to kind of confront China. So it's still to be seen what's going to happen in that dynamic.
What do you think the Venezuela intervention told us about the question of sovereignty? Because I've seen so many conflicting arguments on this. I've involved myself in some of the discussion as well. You have people like Marine Le Pen who put out a statement saying, listen, are we in favor of sovereignty or not? And if we are, then we shouldn't support going into a country and removing the head of state, however much of a son of a bitch he might have been. But then you have others, especially in the MAGA movement, who try to present the intervention in Venezuela as an assertion of American sovereignty. So this was America saying, listen, you've intruded upon our territory via drugs and immigration. And, these things may or may not be accurate, but that's their argument. And therefore, this is a reassertion of our sovereign rights against your meddling. So it's a kind of complicated discussion, but it does seem like America doesn't necessarily want to be seen as taking a hammer to sovereignty, even though some of us suspect that that's what it did with the Venezuela intervention. What do you think this raises about the question of sovereignty in the 21st century?
I think that sovereignty is always under threat. So just because it's in principle inviolable and we all support it, doesn't mean that it's not going to come under attack by foreign parties. And although there can be clashes of sovereignty, for example, between the United States and Venezuela, that clash um, either resolves itself in a full-scale war, because there are wars between sovereign nations, or in this case, what you have is a more of a hypocritical attempt to try to avoid the real issue at stake. If they had simply grabbed Maduro and just left it at that, then it would not have been necessarily a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. But if you now declare that you're running the show, that you're the viceroy in Venezuela, you pick and choose the government, then I don't think that argument holds up any longer, because it's no longer about migrants and drugs. It's about something very, very different.
Let's talk a little bit about the rules-based order and what people mean when they talk about that, and whether they're right to pine for it. And the thing that really struck me in the discussion after the Venezuela action was people were openly grieving for what they called the rules-based order. I even saw people saying they felt nostalgic for the Iraq War, because even though it was a terrible conflict, at least it was done through certain rules and mechanisms, and the United Nations was consulted, etc., etc. You have this lunatic situation where people think that the Venezuela intervention, which caused, relatively speaking, very little destruction in comparison with the Iraq War, that to them looks worse because in their eyes it falls outside of the beloved rules-based order. What do people mean when they talk about the rules-based order? And is it all that it was cracked up to be, if it ever existed in that sense?
Well, the rules-based order was established in the aftermath of the Second World War, when you had a lot of international institutions, international law, international courts, which formally regulated relations between different powers, the United Nations being particularly important in relation to this. I think that the rule-based system looked really good on paper, but in reality, uh, raw power, hard power, always had the last say, and the Security Council members did more or less what they felt like, whether or not the United Nations agreed with them or not. And you had a situation where sometimes powers made up the rules as they went along. So, for example, the United States bombed Yugoslavia in the last century without a UN mandate. But nevertheless, that was justified in terms of legal precedent and rules. So there's an element of hypocrisy there. But to be sure, there was a situation where certainly the second-rate powers tried to, were forced to keep to the rules and consulted international courts. But in general, the real problem, the really important development there wasn't that there was a rule-based order, but that a lot of the governments have failed to pursue their national interests in a rigorous way. And therefore, you had a situation where they tried to displace realpolitik with economic diplomacy. And the idea was that through trade and economic relations, you could manage the conflict and problems in the globe. And that's what they tried to do. But the rule-based order was never what it seemed to be. And I think you have to remember that today the situation is not simply a Hobbesian survival of the fittest. We still have certain rules. There's far more continuity with what the reality of the last century than people would give credit for.
And in relation to Trump himself and the new kind of era that he represents, because there is a tendency, I think, in commentary circles to just see Trump as this kind of very oafish character who shoots from the hip and does what he wants. But he does also embody genuine shifts in politics and in global politics as well. So it's always worth looking at what he's saying and what he's doing. And if you look at his New York Times interview, which was really interesting, and the most important part, which you drew out in your Substack post on these questions, where he was asked, are there any restraints on what you'll do in the world? If you're not going to obey international law, what will restrain you? And he said, well, there's my own morality, which I thought was just an interesting way of posing it and a very honest way of posing it. Because, there have been American presidents over the past 20 years who have pursued global missions in an incredibly moralistic fashion, but wouldn't necessarily say that that's what they were doing. Um, what did you make of his comments there? I mean, was that indicative of the demise of the rules-based order and the appearance of something new?
I think that was indicative of the fact that America was not pursuing their national interests in an uninhibited, explicit kind of a way. And it's doing that because it's got to appeal to the American people. American people want America to pursue what the nation needs. Because a lot of Americans feel that their national interest was ignored over the last 20, 30 years. And I think that what Trump is doing in this way is using foreign policy as a way of legitimating many of his domestic uh, policies as well. So there's a clear connection between the two. And what Trump is very good at is, to some extent, posturing, demonstrating is basically not subject to any restraint. It's a way of intimidating opponents. It's a way of putting others on the defensive. And when he says, the only thing that restrains him is his own morality, what he's really saying is that he's going to do what he can get away with. And then the United States will do whatever they think is in their best interest and whatever they can get away with. And of course, the reality is that the only restraint on morale on Trump is not his own moral compass, but the reality of hard power globally. And many other actors are not going to let America do whatever it feels like. There is a lot of blowback that America can experience. And certainly China isn't just going to roll over and allow Trump or anybody else to just get on with it, sort of regardless of its consequences.
Yeah, I want to come on to that in a moment, but in relation to Trump and the question of restraint, it's interesting because he talks about being restrained by nothing but his own morality. But even though he says that, he does seem more restrained than those other presidents. He hasn't dragged America into that kind of conflict yet. And in fact, he constantly says he wants to bring that kind of conflict to an end and do things differently. Do you think that kind of the post-Cold War moment when we had these supposedly humanitarian interventions, which were in fact very destructive, is that era now come to a close, and has it been replaced by something that is a bit more driven by the national interest and therefore perhaps a bit more logical?
I think there has been a transition. It's very rare now for those moralistic, humanitarian posturing to be promoted, although it still exists, particularly in Europe, where they are devoting resources to so-called humanitarian concerns. I think you're right to suggest that Trump is more restrained than people give him credit for. Not his rhetoric. His rhetoric is often fairly free-floating and unpredictable, and that's what people find very difficult to deal with. But if you actually look at his record, he's been very, very careful in the way he's engaged with Russia, all right, with China. He's been very, very careful even in his reaction to Iran. So although he talked about we might do this and we might do that, there hasn't really been anything so far, as far as I can tell, in terms of major intervention. And I think that what Trump is really very good at as a performer, he uses the social media, he uses television, he uses all the technologies that are available to put on this public performance, which is now very important in global politics. And there he is a real master compared to the other politicians, political leaders. He's far better at managing the social media and the media in general. So I think that that's what he is doing, and the image of being unrestrained is belied by his own action, which is much more careful than people realize.
So let's talk a little bit about the Greenland question. which is a sentence I never thought I would say. I didn't tend to think about Greenland very much, but lots of people are talking about it now. Trump wants it. He says, I'm going to get it one way or another. Um, Denmark is not very happy. Although, of course, a discussion not many people want to have is, why does Denmark have Greenland? That's another question that we could put on the table if we wanted to. In terms of the shifting nature of global alliances and international relations, it feels to me that the Greenland question is very important because it is raising to the surface the question of NATO, the question of America's relationship with Europe, the question of whether Europe has the capacity to act in its own interests or not. So Greenland, it's an important question. What do you think is driving that at the moment? What is driving Washington's interest in that question?
It's very difficult to be completely clear about it because, as you suggest, on the one hand, it's got a very strong dimension which calls into question the classical relation between the United States and Europe, and it calls into question the role of the United States in NATO. I mean, those things are very much um, put to question, but they were put to question anyway. I mean, these conflicts pre-existed the discussion on Greenland, and you could tell that there's a certain kind of dynamic there where America wants to establish a different relation with Europe and within NATO, and particularly America in particular is quite interested in Europe no longer becoming simply what he considered so parasitical on American protection as was the case in the past. So to some extent, he's shaking up Europe quite self-consciously, and he's been doing that in a number of different kind of ways. I think that what's really paradoxical about Greenland is that, according to all treaties that are already been signed, America can do whatever it wants in Greenland. It's got the right to station as many troops as it wants in there. And I would imagine nobody would push back against American companies uh, gaining a foothold in Greenland, particularly mining companies having access to the different kind of resources. So there's a kind of interesting performative element to this because at the end of the day, there's no need for this, and there's no need for all this discussion about we're going to take Greenland, other than to demonstrate to the world that America is a major player. It's able to dominate the globe. That's a kind of a statement that's being made. But again, I think it's really performative rather than an example of realpolitik or serious diplomacy. Because if Washington really wanted Greenland, wanted economic access to Greenland, wanted to own large chunks of Greenland, wanted to station troops in Greenland, it could achieve this quietly behind the scenes, after a few hours of diplomacy.
What do you think the response in Europe is likely to be if this gets pushed further? I mean, Denmark has already said hands off, basically. And it was interesting that European leaders, including Keir Starmer, seemed a little more willing to speak out on the Greenland question than they were on the Venezuela question. Keir Starmer really tied himself in knots on Venezuela and suddenly lost all his old commitment to legal niceties and so on. But he has spoken out a little bit on Greenland. Do you think Europe is worried about this? Do they recognize, do you think, that America is doing what you described, which is kind of kicking the hornet's nest to a certain extent?
Oh yeah, I think they're very conscious of this. I mean, the discussion in all the capitals of Europe is about this new reality that they're
Yeah.
confronted with, and they are very much aware of the fact that they are going to have to, at some point, do something. They've been avoiding doing anything. They continually have conferences and talk about helping Ukraine this way, helping that country that way, but they've been avoiding actually doing anything. This has been a long process of evasion, and I think that their reaction to Greenland is typical in this respect because they're gonna say hands off Greenland, and they're gonna say that as in chorus. But if Trump decides to take Greenland, there's no doubt in my mind that the Western nations of Europe are simply gonna have to roll over. They're not gonna take on Trump. There's no danger of that at all. And I think that what they're really hoping is that somehow a quick behind the scenes deal can be done which lets them off the hook.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Iran and the questions that it raises. I mean, just the most extraordinary events are taking place there. It seems, from an outside perspective, to be a huge uprising. It's very difficult to tell exactly what's going on in the country, but it seems really, really important. Whether the Islamic Republic is teetering on the brink or can pull back and enforce its authority, that remains to be seen. Um, and there are questions, of course, should America intervene? Should Europe help? And all of that stuff. But how significant do you think that is? I mean, it seems to me that if the Islamic Republic were to fall, and we have no idea if that's about to happen or if that's a realistic prospect, seems to me that that would be a pretty epoch-shaking event in terms of what Iran has represented globally and the role that it plays in the Middle East and so on. What have you made of the events in Iran and the impact they could have?
Well, it's very important. You have to remember that people never understood at the time the significance of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which was huge. They just merely saw it as a regime change in a Middle East country, not realizing the wave of events that would be unleashed in its aftermath. I think that events are very significant because the opposition and the demonstration is very different than previous protests against the Islamic Republic, because it now involves precisely those layers of Iranian society that were active in the 1979 revolution: the shopkeepers, the small, the small bazaar type stallholders, and basically ordinary people, not the students, not the middle classes, but ordinary people that have been economically hit by the phenomenal rate of inflation that exists there. So you can see that this is an event that has encompassed the whole of the country, virtually every town, not just cities, but virtually every town throughout Iran has been involved in this whole protest. And it seems to me that the tragedy is that the government, the regime, obviously still has all the arms. They still have all the weapons. Um, there's a layer of security officials that are totally devoted to the regime. The army probably less so, but it's unlikely in the short run that you're going to have the army, sort of go on to sort of basically join the side of the people. And I don't see anything really changing in Iran, anything fundamental changing in Iran until the military, not the guards, but the military actually comes on this, and joins the side of the people, which is possible because their family members are very similar to the people that are protesting there. But it's very fluid, and all that we can do is hope. I don't think that foreign intervention would be very helpful, because if you had the West, for example, America, and anybody else intervening, it could easily just simply create a degree of solidarity around the government. It's a very kind of difficult situation with knowing exactly what the impact of foreign intervention is. But given what we know from previous events where people have intervened, I'm not very optimistic about the positive consequences of that.
I agree. I like regime change when it's done by the people themselves, but not so much when it's imposed from without. That tends not to work out very well. When you talk about people not understanding the global historic importance of the revolution of 1979, um, it seems to me that there's a real sense of caution now amongst Western observers and Western politicians about what is happening in Iran. There's this kind of dual thing going on where on the one hand, people pay lip service to the bravery of the protesters and especially the young women who people feel a closer alignment with, I guess, than they do with the kind of old, grouchy, bizarre market stallholders. But as you say, it's a combination of very different forces, which makes it incredibly powerful. Um, but at the same time as paying that lip service, there is a real palpable sense of caution. People seem incredibly worried about what might happen in Iran. And of course, uprisings can have hugely destabilizing consequences, both within the country itself and regionally too. Do you think that caution is driven by fear or just by a reluctance for an upset of this gravity? I mean, the removal of the Islamic Republic, even though it's a detestable regime, would be a huge upset in global affairs and especially regional affairs. What do you think underpins that kind of caution people have when they look at this pretty glorious revolt that's taken place?
Well, I think fear is a factor, but even more important than fear is just cowardice. Just just the belief that this, we had our fingers burned so many times in the Middle East. We now have a situation where the blowback from the Middle East has got very important domestic implications, even in our own society here in Europe. So governments are very, very, very loath to take a principled position in relation to events in the Middle East. And as you know, they've been collaborating with all kinds of dubious actors in that part of the world. I mean, they are not, they have not been particularly courageous in terms of making distinction between, who they should support, and who they shouldn't support. The latest example being Syria, where suddenly the new regime in Syria is seen as like God's gift to democracy in that part of the world. So I think that there is a kind of sense of cowardice based on the fact that their policy, their diplomacy has failed so frequently in the Middle East. And what you left it is basically this sense of horror, where you who have the BBC and other institutions talking about some students that have been killed, and talking in almost like a human interest stories, which that they're presenting, rather than dealing with it as a social and political reality that can have great, very important kind of consequences. So, yeah, I mean, I think the cowardice element is very, very strong here. By the way, nobody commented on the large loss of lives, the massacres that have occurred, by using the same language that they were using in relation to Gaza. I don't know if you remember, but there used to be a massacring apparently in Gaza, but that's just not ignored, and it's quietly forgotten in relation to Iran.
I've enjoyed seeing all those journalists saying, well, we can't get into Iran, so we don't know the full story. Whereas they also couldn't get into Gaza and they never shut up about it. So the levels of hypocrisy and double standards right now are extraordinary. So just looking at the broader Middle East and the question of the reordering of international affairs, there is a reordering happening in the Middle East, it seems, not just the Iran question, which I think is the big question. That is a real huge question mark over that region. But also, if you look at what's happening in relation to Israel with the Abraham Accords and Saudi Arabia, importantly, and other nations creating this kind of new alliance that accepts the right of Israel to exist. And one of the arguments put forward is that Iran, via Hamas, one of the reasons they carried out 7th of October was to scupper this kind of new arrangement and to try and hold on to some of the old arrangements. How important are those developments? I mean, Israel, it seems to me, is always under threat, not only regionally, but also globally, with the kind of demented Israelophobia that has been spreading for a long time. Is security finally going to come Israel's way? Do you think the Middle East will change in Israel's favor? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think it's early days, and there are some signs of informal alliances being forged. And behind the scenes, there's a lot of diplomatic activity between Israel and Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states. That's pretty much the case because they do have certain common interests, particularly the fact that Iran is a problem for all of them. Hamas was a problem potentially for all of them. And these states have got their own internal difficulties that are often not publicized or they kind of kept at bay. So I think that's been a positive development for Israel. But I'm fairly realistic about developments. And I think that at the end of the day, Israel and Israeli security depends upon Israelis alone. When push comes to shove, Israel cannot in the long run rely upon the durability of these accords. Simple reason that the signatories to these accords are themselves have regimes that are not that stable, that can easily change from one day to the next. So the new reality that you're discussing is at the moment fairly superficial. It may gain traction and it may develop roots, but at the moment it's still very, very early days. And one hopes that that will be the case, that will gain momentum. But we just have to wait and see. And obviously, if the Iranian situation leads to the real weakening of the regime, then it will make that easier. It will help that those accords to have a bit of meaning to them.
To bring it to a close, I want to ask you about the big powers, the mighty world powers and the relations between them. Because you said something really interesting earlier on, and this is also in the things you've been writing over the past week, which everyone should read. Really interesting stuff. You talked about how Trump says, "Look, the only restraint on what I want to do is my own morality," and as you point out, that's not quite true. I mean, it's just not true at all, because questions of hard power have a very long-standing habit of impressing themselves on world affairs, political affairs, and so on. So what do you mean by that hard power? How do you envisage that playing out, especially vis-a-vis America and China? I mean, previously in the past, you've described China as a bit of a status quo power. It's not a power that loves to launch reckless wars or to do to do things on the world stage that might undermine its interests, whereas America in recent years has behaved quite recklessly in global affairs. Do you envisage open conflict between these two powers, or how do you envisage that kind of one hard power versus another? How's that likely to play out in the world?
I think that at the moment, the big powers are keeping things fairly level-headed because they realize that any kind of confrontation in terms of military confrontation can have very destructive effects. China in particular is not that interested in projecting hard power, even though it's really built up its military capabilities, a massive navy, huge army. And even though it's continually threatening Taiwan, it's been fairly careful in actually doing very much. Because what China is very good at is using its economic and technological muscle to make gains throughout the globe. And that's what they're really interested in, is projecting China outward. So China has now got an ambition to be a genuine global power, not just simply a regional power. And it's using essentially its economic clout to achieve this. And it doesn't want to get distracted from that. And any kind of military action would not really assist its present strategic vision that it has. I think the United States is a little bit different. The United States is really in the middle of developing clarity about its place in the world. It's gone through decades of confusion, decades where its leaders have failed to support its national interest. I mean, they were completely confused about what America should really do. And now I think they're having a hard think that in the 21st century, what's America's place? And they're kind of almost like experimenting. They're trying out different things. But the really interesting thing for me is that when you look at all the major players and even including like India, um, you put Europe together, what we have is not like the classical division of the world into hard power blocks, particularly hard power geographical blocks, but almost like competing networks where their interest often interweaves. So, for example, even despite the sanctions against Russia, a lot of European countries are buying oil from Russia. It's one of their dirty little secrets. Despite all the talk about economic boycotts and whatever, America is forced to have a fairly active relationship where it sells chips, which is meant to protect to China. So where you have America being very reliant on China for certain technologies and for certain energy sources. So there's a kind of interdependence, and not only that, but if you take Latin America, what you have is China and America competing alongside each other in Latin America. So it's very different than in the past where you kind of were able to exclude competing powers from your own zone of interest. Now it's much more interweaving, and you have networks of relationships that are running in parallel with each other. I don't know how long that could continue, but at the moment, I don't think we're in a position. The only thing that worries me is that sometimes if you do things that you haven't worked out, you may unleash a chain of events which leads to great power conflicts. So, for example, take the situation where Britain and America uh, hijacked or took over the Russian flagged ships near Britain. Now that's a small thing, but sometimes you could create a conflict out of that, which then forces Russia to react, and then Britain reacts, and you again create a chain of events that are potentially create a conflict. That can happen in Taiwan, where rather than just hold back, somebody gets carried away, um, pushes a little bit too much, and then China is then forced to react because it's not gonna, basically be humiliated by anybody. So there are possibilities of conflict, but these were the kind of conflicts that are almost accidental, but then it can have deep consequences in terms of something profound being created, something profound being unleashed in the world. You have to remember that nobody expected First World War to have the character that it did. And all that it took was a few things, few small things, or one thing led to another to kind of create that kind of escalation. And that can happen. But that's not really imminent within the kind of conflicts that exist between great powers at the moment.
In relation to the great powers, um, what are the prospects of a new global settlement of some sort? I mean, you talk about you in the pieces you've written, you said that we're unlikely to see the emergence of, strictly speaking, geographical spheres of influence in the traditional sense. But it does sometimes seems as if, whether consciously or otherwise, the world is being reorganized around kind of hemispherical influence. So America is reclaiming that part of the world, including Latin America and its influence there. China has great influence in Asia, of course, but there's the question mark of India. What will India do? What role will India play? Europe is a little bit of a busted flush, but it kind of is controlling its own territory to a certain extent. Is there a possibility that we will see the emergence of a new global settlement, whether it is long lasting or not, that will kind of divide the world in a neater way than might have been in the past, or is that not on the books?
Well, there are two preconditions to achieve that, and that those two preconditions are ones that have some way away from realizing it. The first one is that all the big nations, in fact, all the nations have to be clearer about their national interest and have a kind of long-term strategic sensibility, which at the moment a lot of them are struggling to achieve. The second thing is you need to have a greater degree of stability whereby you can establish some kind of balance of power. And again, we're far away from that. And earlier you said that China dominates Asia, but that's not completely the case because even in Asia, aside from India, a lot of the countries like Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia are trying to have it both ways. They're trying to have relation with America and China, pretty much mirroring what's happening in Latin America. So things are very much more confusing than great power blocks in the classical sense.
Yeah, that's an important point. And that brings me on to my final question for you, Frank, which is about the national interest. And one of the points you make is that we are seeing a slow but seemingly steady move towards an era in which states assert their national interest a bit more clearly than they might have done previously. Um, what do you think underpins that? I mean, for a period of time and after the Second World War, there tended to be this um, process through which the national interest was masked or hidden or pooled. You had the rise of global alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact and these other things which actively suppressed national interest and gave rise to this kind of supposedly global approach to global affairs. Was never very convincing, and conflict was continually bubbling under the surface, even of those alliances. What has caused the return of the national interest? And the more important question is that's a good thing, right? If states are more clear that they are pursuing their national interest rather than some other bullshit mission they might have done in the past. That's a better thing, isn't it?
It is because you're very clear about who you are, what you're about. And therefore, it's quite right and proper that you want to pursue your own nation interest. Nothing really wrong with that. It's actually quite simple. The reason why we've lost the capacity to project our national interest is that the elites of our society, the ruling classes, themselves have become so detached from the nation, so detached from their own people, so much involved in that kind of cosmopolitan networks that very often they're unclear about what their nation's interests are. Very often, the British ruling classes, the French ruling classes, have more in common with each other than with their own people. So when you have a situation where, for these people, the nation is not seen as being particularly important, it's not surprising that their minions in the foreign offices are also unclear about how to pursue diplomacy. And I think that's the price we have paid for the way in which the elites have become detached from their society, particularly in the West. And until, I would imagine, you're able to replace them or have more sensible rulers in those societies, there will be a real struggle to develop a stronger sense of nation, a stronger sense of understanding what the people of your society need in order to develop that sense of interest.
Frank, thank you very much.